Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa, Idris, with me Sharaad, Kuttan, and we're chatting to Dr. Alex Görlach about the world order, the liberal world order. I want to pick up on something that you said just before the break, and to kind of put it into context of what's happening around the world. We're seeing a spate of protests around the world. Talk to me a little bit about how perhaps the democracy model that we know of, perhaps the American model of democracy, may no longer be relevant in today's age.
After the Second World War, in the Pacifics and in Western Europe, the United States deployed like a model, if you will, that was like, let's not talk about politics first, let's just try to build something together economically. And that's happened in again, the Pacifics and Western Europe, and then the so-called economic miracle took off in Germany. And what happened in that time was like, if you went to school, if you worked hard, you could just had a better living. And social inequalities, when they arose, they were also like then, some would say covered up or paid or whatever by social welfare. And this happened through indebting. And nowadays we live in a world where natural resources shrink, where we don't have interest rates anymore as we used to be. So this whole model that's based on growth will be coming to an end, and we all know it. And now also we see like the scarcity, the alleged or the real scarcity in goods kicking in. And this is why people cannot be like, or are not as keen as they used to be a few decades ago to also like help others. Being like cosmopolitans in the true sense of the word, it meant like we are engaged with the whole human family. And now we realize people retrieve to kinship and family, and this is due to the crisis of the economic model.
What about the European story? We know Germany is deeply embedded in the cornerstone of the European ideal of a federated Europe. Where is that going? Perhaps not a Scandinavian model of welfareism, but some sort of social democratic compact that is, as you say, underpin the democratic experiment in Europe. Is that something that's still worth saving?
Well, I feel that's actually, if you look on the global map, that's what makes Europe special, that it found a middle ground of like capitalism and communism and socialism, if you will. That we in Europe, we acknowledge the market, but the market can never be unhinged. So in that sense, we are a little closer to the Chinese even, where they have like, they invest into infrastructure. Europeans would always invest into infrastructure and say, this is kind of a common good. Whereas in the United States, when you say like, oh, we invest in that, people say, well, that's socialism. So I feel that the European model actually in today's world has the most bandwidth, if you will, to cope with these developments nowadays.
Well, I want to kind of talk about the G0 world, right? Where there's that kind of a vacuum of political and economic leadership from the world's superpowers, once the world's superpowers. I mean, all these, I guess, decision makers are so fixated on addressing some of the domestic crises that no one is actually taking leadership for the global leadership. And I think that could come with an array of consequences in the midterm and the long term. Talk to me about where you see Europe in this, specifically Germany. Is there a position for Europe to be leading the world when it comes to making these decisions?
So, I mean, literally, I totally agree with your analysis. And Germany as an export nation is like very much focused on this aspect. So when it comes to talking to foreign powers, like let's say the People's Republic of China, it will always be like the economic interest first. Having said that, however, and I feel also the Germans, because they are as powerful as they are nowadays, they are one of the few nations that then actually also can say something about the human rights issues. So when former head of state Joachim Gauck went to China and saw President Xi Jinping, they had like 90 minutes FaceTime, and I'm sure he brought up some human rights issues. So this is like a good example nowadays where soft power and hard power, if you will, go hand in hand, because the United States have obviously, like under Donald Trump, retrieved from this sort of soft power approach, and this is why we see a vacuum nowadays, and China has been eager trying to filling it.
What about the US? Where does the US sit? I mean, you've spent time in the US in the last few years. Where do you see America in this G0 world?
It's literally astonishing. Like 25 years ago, Samuel Huntington wrote this book about the clash of civilizations, and he predicted that the world will be like not be bipolar anymore, will have like lots of centers of gravity, if you will. And the Western world in his idea was like one of many, but still led by the United States of America. And he would be looping in his grave. He would be seeing like, what the heck's going on nowadays? So literally what we perceive as the Western world is like in a deep crisis because the United States has given up on its leadership role.
So coming back to Europe and some of the debacles, we see Brexit, the big issue around Brexit is a failure of Europe to respond, we are told, to the needs of Britons, right? Their aspirations, or their suspicion about Brussels and so on and so forth. We also see it in Italy and so on and so forth. Do you think that Europe has kind of turned the corner on that? Or is that something that's going to stay with Europe for a long time? And intellectuals like yourself, I mean, where do you stand in the discussions about where Europe should be or aspire to be?
The thing is, like, globalization has brought upon us like a new, like, global middle class, if you will, but at the same time it has also like delivered like a new lower class, and this is like very difficult to disentangle. You see like rising GDPs, but this is like Chile, for instance, outside of Europe, but still, but that's due to automatization, leads to more efficiency and more productivity. So if you look at the GDP, you say, oh, everything is great, but then if you look, assuming that means people have more money in their pockets, which they don't. Even in Germany, like, let's say the workforce is about 40 million people, so 9 million people work in the low income sector. So literally they serve in a coffee shop, like where they make like $7.50 an hour, like a coffee, like you know, like a super fancy coffee for the same money. They work for an hour, and then they see like people like you know, just in the hundreds a day who can spend this money they make in 1 hour. Francis Fukuyama, in his recent book on identity, called this like the feeling of indignation. So when people like go and work and they do not make enough to meet ends, that creates like this feeling of like I do not belong, I cannot participate. And if you are like a father, a mother and 2 children, and visiting the cinema costs you $100, then clearly you feel like disentangled, and that is a crisis of democracy, because democracy lives by the promise that people can participate in the public sphere.
What about the identity of Europe as a coming together of Christian nations? And I know in Germany there is an organization called Pegida, which is anti-Muslim. But does that go to a deeper problem about how Europeans identify themselves, kind of on the surface, secular, but actually with deeply held notions about them being Christians?
So there's been last year, there has been a survey by the Pew Institute in DC, and that was like, the results were rather astonishing. So they asked about Christian affiliation across Europe. So 90% of the surveyed answered they are baptized. So they remember that at some point they were made Christians, obviously. So that 90%, that means like by numbers, this is still like a Christian continent, if you wanna call it like that. 70% said they would Christian values, whatever that means, matter in their life. 20% out of them only go to church every week. So clearly religion had, like in many other parts of the world, has a public dimension. It also has a political dimension. So Christianity is still one of the pillars of today's Europe, at least in the assumptions of its populace. So this is why when you are an immigrant from a Muslim nation, for instance, that raises to many like some suspicions about loyalty and about belonging. Also, like on the other hand, by the people who come to our countries. However, I'd also say the notion is like that religion, if religion matters, it's also the question like it's not about the past but about the future and the present. So in the refugee crisis there were lots of debates about what does it mean actually to be a Christian continent? What do we have to help the refugees, and to what extent? So just to hold it like the Pegida people, they are called patriotic Europeans to save Europe from Islamization, and literally they take off like in a part of Germany which used to be like in the communist part of Germany, like in Dresden, as you said, and there's the percentage of Christians in that city is 10%. And you see like in many parts of Europe, like the people who have never seen a foreigner, who have never seen a Muslim, are the most against them. So like liberal values as in terms of cosmopolitan values, or democratic values as in terms of tolerance, they are very much upheld like in metropolis areas. And if you look into, also that Fukuyama wrote this in his book, like if you look for a common denominator in the Brexit vote and the vote for Donald Trump, it's not socioeconomic, it's not age, it's not gender, it's the population density. So as less populated the region is, as more inclined people are to buy in all these us versus them narratives.
Okay, so what can we learn from that? I mean, using that premise, what can we learn about the spread of these ideas?
So I feel in Europe, and we spoke about religion now, when human rights came about in the 16th century, the notion of that, it was about religious toleration. So, and I feel this is still very, very high up there, and when Europeans talk about it, but there's also like there's iterations in our understanding of human rights. And now, coming back to what we said about the global economic crisis, there is also like human rights for fresh air, clean water and all this. And that also in the end means like a fair and just economic system. And this is what we have to learn, I believe. This is also an example that Europe can give to the world, like how we iterate our idea and notion of human rights.
All right, we're going to continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes. Make sure you stay tuned to consider this.